Welcome to the We Are Lach podcast. I am Lavinia.
I am Chris.
And I am Heather.
You can find our introduction in the podcast feed and in the show notes to this episode.
This is our third episode and still very experimental.
And today, our guest is, again, one of the hosts.
Yes, it is Heather. Heather, we know that you spent 7 years or so working in higher education, specifically in the UK on education for sustainable development. What are your main thoughts on that, what we may call industry?
Yeah, thank you, Lavinia. So the years I was in that position as the project coordinator for embedding sustainable development within the curriculum in UK universities, those years were 2005 to 2012. And then I did do a bit of work in 2018, 2019, managing editor for a related book. So 2005, we are talking nearly 20 years ago. And I just had a birthday, so I'm feeling it. I'm still on an email list for lecturers, professors who work in that area. And I see, unfortunately, the exact same questions coming up as I did 20 years ago. And, these are good people, and they're people who want to be able to say on their deathbeds that they did something to try to counter climate change and environmental destruction and make the world a better place. But so little has changed. Emissions are going up, environmental destruction continues, and we know that there are systemic reasons for this. Two of them are C words, but not what you might think: capitalism and colonialism. And so while universities are always putting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal logos and links all over the place, we actually see a huge disconnect in what is really happening in universities. And actually, I'm feeling really sick to my stomach today, and have been for many days now, because of what's happening with Palestinians and in Lebanon, in Congo, Sudan, Haiti. We're recording this Monday, 21st October. This morning I heard a brief update of what had been happening at the weekend. And it's just, it makes me sick to my stomach. And universities claim to care about sustainable development goals, and yet they're complicit with the genocide in terms of military connections and funding around Israel. And I mean, just think about genocide as I read to you these sustainable development goals. Okay? No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, clean water and sanitation, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, climate action, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions. I mean, how any university who claims to care about these goals can just be not doing everything they can to stop genocide. And yet it's the opposite. It's the opposite, because when university students begin to protest, the universities aren't backing them up. They're repressing students and staff who are protesting genocide. So I came across this article from October 6th from Truth Out. And so I'm going to quote from it. And the article quotes a Palestinian student who's a member of Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP. And she's a student at the University of Vermont, UVM. And the quote goes, "Nearly Every university administration in the US is cracking down on what they rightfully see as a threat to their profits and investments in Israeli colonization, and UVM is no exception. At UVM, the administration is stretching itself thin, trying to preserve its image as a progressive, socially conscious institution while remaining just as complicit in the genocide as any other neoliberal university. Instead of responding to the encampment period with riot police and tear gas like other universities, UVM placed our organization on an illegal suspension in an attempt to stifle the emergence of an organized mass student movement. We are fighting this suspension in court. It is no surprise that UVM has suspended our SJP chapter, she continued. UVM has historically silenced Palestinians and our struggles for liberation taking place on campus. From the cancellation of an event featuring Mohammed El-Kurt in the fall of 2023 to saying the word Palestinian for the first time only after 3 Palestinian students were shot just a block away from campus. It is clear who UVM has deemed as their enemy. Their attacks against us have become the testing ground for their ability to repress any form of dissent against an increasingly corporatized university, profiting off the oppressed and exploited masses of the world. That is why we have filed a lawsuit aiming to reverse our unconstitutional suspension, unquote. So I think universities are a farce when it comes to sustainable development, and it's heartbreaking. Even if you put to one side the genocide of Palestinians, you only have to look at where university money comes from, where it goes, and the kinds of careers it is producing to see that universities have been a failure and continue to fail in many, many ways. You know, on that email list that I'm still on, someone posted last month about a course they are running on Palestine and the genocide. And someone replied, a white woman, that this is not relevant to sustainable development. Nobody else backed her up, fortunately, and a couple of us defended the post about the course. But what is going on here? Even if you don't care about humans, and there are people in the environmental movement that do not care about humans, surely you think that Israel bombing day after day for a year, more than a year now, has an impact on climate change and environmental destruction. So I feel sick by the higher education for sustainable development industry. And that's where I'm at today.
Heather, thank you for sharing all of this, and particularly in a way that really makes me grateful for this podcast, which is to say a way that goes under the surface conversation and uncovers these really important elements of power and who has power and who projects power. In some sense, who has the right to project power and where does this quote unquote right come from? And we call these discussions under many labels. We talk about colonialism, oppression, justice, and of course, genocide, even as a concept, is one of the most extreme, if not the most extreme, expressions of these different types of forces that indeed and unfortunately are very much as real today as they were 200, 300, and 400 years ago. You're drawing a contrast between universities claiming to stand for the UN Sustainable Development Goals while simultaneously repressing students who speak out against the genocide in Palestine. And I was just talking a moment ago about power and who has power, how power perpetuates, and who has the quote unquote right to express power. So, could you share your thoughts, indeed, from your own experience, decades of experience, about what enables such power dynamics to exist and perpetuate? I know that all universities are different, but I'm particularly thinking of the billion-dollar endowments of the elite universities in the United States of America. Now, I wonder what other revenue streams these universities try to cultivate, because it's clear that student tuition is just one of multiple revenue streams for universities like these. There are, of course, research grants from government agencies. There are partnerships with corporations, revenue from real estate ownership, and so on. So I'm being honest here, I'm still trying to grapple with my observation that some universities don't seem to care all that much about being quote unquote bastions of free speech, or indeed about being responsive to their students on the topic of genocide in Palestine. And I'm trying really hard to just understand, what do these universities really care about then? And how do we know?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, it's a bit like nonprofit organizations as well, the nonprofit industrial complex, where you're like, what is the point of them? And I think we talked about this on your podcast, Lavinia, your episode about fashion. It's like so many organizations, their goal is to keep themselves alive and to keep themselves earning money and keep their jobs and that. And so that's why I guess we have to follow the money with a university, and we have to look at what motivations like the the heads of universities have for what they do, how much they're getting paid, um, who has positions to do what, like maybe what percentage is actually going to the delivery of contact with students. That could be interesting to look at. We look at individual staff members. So many of them are staying quiet about the genocide, and we understand this is happening outside of universities as well, but people are scared to lose their jobs because we live in a capitalist society, and there are big repercussions if you can't afford your insulin, or you can't pay the rent, or feed your kids. So they want to keep their jobs, they want to keep their funding. These are all perverse incentives, and Lavinia and I have economics backgrounds. And so the conditions are such that universities end up rewarding behavior that is completely out of alignment with their own stated vision, purpose, mission, and values. But what is heartening and gives me hope is that so many people now, especially young people at university age, are becoming radicalized by what they see, because it's just become so obvious, like what the universities actually care about and who they don't care about. And now they're seeing the same with politicians. That, we have a US election coming up in a couple of weeks, and that, your choice is genocide or genocide, or your choice is cops or cops, like there is no liberatory anti-oppression choice here. So how are people to express? I mean, that's not a democracy. People don't have the option of expressing what they actually want. It's disgusting. It's sad, but it's great that so many people are recognizing it now.
Thanks, Heather, for sharing. I don't know if you two know, but I do give lectures at universities since approximately 1.5 years on business ethics and sustainability in the consumer goods industry. And yeah, I actually cut ties with two institutions because I don't think that I was anxious that they might, like kick me out, like a lot of colleagues of mine, for advocating for what I'm advocating, but I was pretty proactive. And I told them, or I asked them about their morality with regard to what is going on in the world. Then I had to decide, or I decided to leave two institutions. And I think we're going to talk about our own experiences being at universities a little later in this episode. But what would interest me, Heather, to like hear and listen to your perspective, because the universality, or the concept of universality, which is pretty new to me, and I haven't questioning this in the past properly, right? But like, how do you perceive the traditional idea of the university? I mean, already linguistically, right? Universal university as this bastion of universal knowledge. And in what ways do you think this concept has evolved or been challenged or not in recent years? And do you think we can challenge this in the future?
Yeah, I'm no expert on the history of all of this, but I suppose the idea of the universal being in the particular and the particular being in the universal means that, well, that would be the goal, I would think. That would be my vision of learning and sharing knowledge and perspectives. That when we when I look outside my window and see the the bark that I bought to put over what used to be grass, and if you think about just this tiny, tiny garden, which in the US you would call a backyard, just super tiny, and you focus on that, you end up expanding out to colonialism and capitalism because, what's under the soil, what's in the soil, where did I get this wood from? It all shows up. And so if universities, and I mean the physical infrastructure of a university, it's full of resources, it's spaces. And so those could be community spaces, not just saved for people in the US who can afford to go to university, or saved for, people who get certain grades in Europe to be able to go to university. If it was a community space, then people of all ages, 2-year-olds running around, mingling with people who understand science, would begin to understand their local community, see how it affects and is affected by the rest of the world. And we would learn about systems and systems thinking, and what makes sense locally to get our needs met, our needs for a healthy food, our needs for clean water, for clean air, to be able to grapple with that, rather than it being this weird cult-like institution, where people, like, there's like these cult dynamics and white supremacy culture patterns of, who holds the knowledge, um and what kind of games you have to play to know the right people for a career. And instead of, no, we're here to figure out how to meet people's needs. locally and around the world. And so, yeah, it's just so sad. It's just full of resources. And yet it's protected and being jealously guarded by typically older, whiter, male like people. You know, it's a sad misuse of what humans are capable of.
Yeah, I was reading perhaps somewhere on LinkedIn, might have been yesterday or the day before, this series of posts describing how donations to Harvard University have dropped 15% recently because of, I don't know, quote unquote politics. People don't agree with the quote unquote politics. And I'm not sure if this is disrespectful or, or if certain institutions even deserve my respect, but I thought to myself, wow, 15%, a 15% drop to only what? $1 billion? Instead of 1.5 billion in donations, maybe it's $1 billion now. And I don't remember what the exact numbers were. I'm kind of making that up, maybe a little bit facetiously, but this is the order of magnitude we're talking about for a university of Harvard stature. It's not in the hundreds of thousands or the millions even. It's in the billions of donations in terms of dollars, in terms of the size of the endowment, tens of billions. So we think of these institutions, or maybe I shouldn't say we. I think I want to be very careful with the use of the word we. Let me actually tie this back to what you just said, Heather, which is the emphasis, the incentive to jealously guard one's resources. And in a very real way, a brand is also a type of resource. It's the resource that you use to portray yourself as deserving of all of this money and deserving of keeping it for all sorts of reasons. Maybe you portray yourself as the smart one, so you know what's best to spend all the money on. And there are so many dynamics underneath that are actually cultural, right? Cultural expressions of power that keep these systems going. And it's ironic, maybe irony is not the right word, but we were talking earlier about the incentive for universities, certain universities, perhaps many universities or most, to do things that are not just maybe out of line with their stated values, but in some senses the opposite of their stated values. So I appreciate a conversation that looks at these underlying structures and how they're perpetuated financially, culturally, technically as well. And you talk about universities as being places to help meet people's needs and support people in meeting their needs. I was just reading an article earlier this morning by a man named Dr. Shaquille McLean. He wrote it back in 2016, not long after the United States of America elected Donald Trump to be president. And he critiques the portrayal of science as an objective and a neutral endeavor. And he grounds the portrayal of science, especially science done in universities, in the context of, well, what is science for? Who's using it? And the sort of nation state perpetuation of power and using technical ends to perpetuate this type of power, colonialism and militarism. And certainly for me, being trained as an engineer, I can relate to both of these aspects. Number one, the aspect of portraying science and engineering in the university as objective endeavors that stand alone on the top of the pinnacle of knowledge type thing. And then my choice, I believe is my choice to build relationships with people who are outside of the schools of science and engineering and begin to appreciate that they actually had different perspectives, that they were talking about this word politics in ways I didn't understand at the time. Not just about democratic elections and Republican presidents and electoral types of politics, but actually about power and culture and structures and systems and how all these things perpetuate. And in some sense, actually work to make themselves invisible, especially in technical domains, so that the people who are taught to practice science and engineering are taught with the illusion that they are the only people who have real knowledge and real information. So for my undergraduate degree, I went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, and I studied what we called aeronautics and astronautics. Now, I believe personally there's nothing inherently military about aerodynamics, thermodynamics, control theory, and so on. Yet, it is undeniable to me that the vast majority of, shall we say, advancements in aeronautical engineering came from the literal weaponization of aeronautics and astronautics. Many students in my class went to military service. Many faculty in our department were retired military. Many companies that recruited on campus were defense contractors. So that is to say, I believe that the MIT Aeronautics and Astronautics Department served, at least when I was a student, as the funnel toward the military industrial complex, even though MIT nominally, quote unquote, divested from direct military work due to student protests during the Vietnam War. So that's where MIT's Lincoln Laboratory came from during a student divestment movement around the Vietnam War. Supposedly, MIT then took their direct defense department related work and stuck it into that institution called MIT Lincoln Labs. But let's be clear, there's still plenty of military research going on, just funded through different vectors. And I also want to add, building on what I said earlier, I didn't learn anything about critical theory, which is to say power relations, through my engineering courses. My exposure to that came from students in other departments, as I mentioned, particularly architecture and urban planning, as well as students who were protesting. This is 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. I still remember protests about the genocide in Darfur, which never ended, it's just changed form. So as a graduate student, I went back to MIT, but then I studied at the intersection of aeronautics and environmental policy. And my graduate work looked at how engine emissions from aircraft affected air pollution and human health. And then I worked in the industry, the aviation environmental industry, for 15 years. But again, without a background in critical theory, it took me many years, maybe too many years, to realize that the entities I was serving as a technical environmental professional were actually using my technical skills to preserve and grow the aviation sector rather than reduce its environmental impacts. So for me, as a trained engineer and a policy analyst, I believe that the beginning of caretaking and undoing harm, and in a real way, meeting local needs and highlighting local contexts, is the teaching about, in my case, coming from a technical background, the teaching of technical industries and how they function, the teaching about how industries grow and maintain their power, and the teaching of how scientists and engineers fit into those systems of power. And in a real way, you're talking about the industry of the university, and also how that industry grows and maintains its power, and how the staff of the university fit into that. Because for me, I think there's a piece here, this piece about teaching students that they don't have to participate in these systems of power if they don't want to. And given a conversation about universities, I think the very act of teaching students such information would be considered by the university itself to be a threatening act. And the repression against students protesting about genocide is a perfect example, because these students are using the consciousness and the knowledge and the history that they learned in the universities themselves. So I'm really embracing this podcast episode with the thought of what could be my place as an individual in teaching science and engineering students, and really students broadly, about systems of power long before they graduate from the university, while they're in positions where they can still change their vectors based on their new knowledge, their consciousness of systems, the existence of systems, and how they function.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, I mean, just being able to look at your own experience like that and be able to see where you were being used, where your skills were being used, and what it might look like to have more agency as a student with what you're going to do. Yeah, Lavinia, when you think back to your university days, your college days, um, what do you think it it could have looked like? Um, when I was talking about it being more based locally, bioregionally, maybe being able to undo harms around the world that have been perpetuated by, in your case, Germany. Um, like where do you see it?
Yeah, thanks for prompting me, Heather. It's a weirdly uncomfortable question for me because while reflecting on the question, I do realize, and I must admit, that I am a person who works very well in this concept. I think it's called meritocracy in English. I know that I've been like very trained to do so. So I received a diagnosis when I was very young, and I think like my loved ones and well, the institutions I visited unconsciously, they didn't want to, do harm, but they trained me. I was trained, so I work very well in the given institutions in these harmful patterns. And when I think about my time in university, I was mostly heartbroken. A lot of things happened. I made great friendships, but I almost never think about an inspiring lecture or anything like that, I must admit. But also, I think, like with 2021, I had accepted that I needed to go to university because I needed to receive, this title in order to start working in the world of work, and become a member of whatever the system is. Nowadays, I know it's called capitalism. So, although I have been driven by this another harmful purpose of white saviorism, right? That's what I always wanted to do, to combine my work with helping and or supporting. I must admit that only recently I think about how a focus, as you said, Heather, on care and community could have transformed my own experience. Having said that, like instead of being seen as just a number or a future employee, because I studied business economics and business administration, what if if we students were viewed as integral parts of a community, capable of enacting change or advocating for justice and so on and so forth. So in light of that, I open up and share a little bit more about my experience. Studying economics, I think it often, anyways, although during that time I didn't properly reflect, I think, on the content which was offered to me. But nowadays I know that I felt, and I'm still feeling, very disconnected from the real world and the pressing issues. So one example is, well, if you study business like economics or business administration, there's only the homo economicus, how we call it in English. I think it's homo economicus in English. Nowadays, I know that these models are fake. And I believe that, as Chris already said, I think in the last podcast, that we are altruistic beings, and that we are trained to be egoistic, right? Or another example is, while studying, I was immersed in economic theories and principles that felt very far removed from the social and environmental realities we face today. Right? So I wasn't taught ecological economics, for example. I was only taught, this one direction. And yeah, nowadays I feel much more frustrated. I think almost 20 years ago, I also felt a little frustrated that we didn't discuss the implications of these theories on marginalized communities or the environment. But well, I did it, whenever I was not in university, with my friends, and the community who was around me, or at work, because I worked a lot in gastronomy. So over there, we talk politics, right? While working night shifts. So, yeah, I think if we reimagined education and higher education to prioritize care and community well-being, as Heather frames it, I believe we could see graduates who are not only knowledgeable in one direction, but also empathetic and engaged in addressing societal issues. One thing what just came up to me was like, why is university only for like young folks and the younger generation? What would happen, if the university would be an institution or a place, where we could all, intergenerationally co-learn? Yeah, that was just coming up to my mind. So in essence, I would love to see universities serving as incubators for empathy and action, I think.
Yeah, that beautiful. Yeah. And just to say, I studied economics, heterodox economics. So even though I was studying what's wrong with mainstream economic theory, it still was books and papers and people gathering for conferences to talk about it. That's academia. Like I think there's no like praxis. Like we don't want this to be something that you just think about, read about, talk about, and write about. Like you said, it needs to be like when we're doing things and we're learning by engaging with life and not with papers and just ideas and staying in insular circles, talking about what area that we want to talk about. And Chris, you talk about interdisciplinarity, and yeah, there's such lack of it. People are just in their narrow fields, and interdisciplinarity ends up being like this very niche thing, that oh, some people might do, but life is interdisciplinary. It just makes no sense to put people in boxes or put 8-year-olds all together, put 12-year-olds all together. Like what are we doing? Everyone's unique and we're all humans. And actually just reminds me that today the YouGov UK poll was about hitting children. Like, do you think parents should be allowed to do that? And at the point that I participated in the poll, it was 60% of people in the UK were saying they should be allowed to smack their children. And like, that's domestic violence. We wouldn't be allowed to say, I don't believe we should. It's just another form of dehumanization. Just like sticking people through school or sticking people through a university degree that's like one size fits all. It's dehumanizing. And, we can wrap up by reminding ourselves like the sheer breadth of dehumanization that is going on in the world right now. Whether that's people in prison, schools, the genocides that are happening. Yeah, and just the way that, people are really struggling who are watching from afar. People are really struggling with like, how can this be happening? Because this is the first time that they've been able to live stream a genocide. We know this has been happening for hundreds of years, this kind of thing, and now we see what it looks like. But more than anything, I think the people in power would like us to normalize it and want us to get used to seeing it so that we can keep working and keep making profits for the multinationals, etc. So, but I don't want us to end on like such that. The note here is to don't go numb. Keep feeling it. Keep connecting with other people on it. Like, don't get bored of seeing posts about it. But make space to feel it, but then also make space to be building community, because this is what we're up against. This is like the future. We see what people in power who feel like they're trapped are doing. And this will come to us, and it is coming to us through climate change and all of that as well, but also can happen through war, etc. And so I think the best antidote to dehumanization is being really human with each other, with the people around us, and making space for grief and taking action together in community, not feeling isolated. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, Heather.
Yes, thank you. And I particularly like, Heather, the way you bring us back to some of the central themes of our podcast, which are not just, like I said earlier, about uncovering systems of power under all of its different labels, colonialism and oppression and so on, but also uncovering, rediscovering over and over again our own agency, not only with ourselves, but with each other. And I think in dark times, it's easy for me to forget and then to become consumed with my immediate needs. And we all have immediate needs. So the continual act of reminding ourselves we have agency to choose what to focus on. We have agency to choose to allow feelings to happen and to be conscious of those feelings and to share those feelings, not just in our own selves, but with individuals. That's something I'm leaving with today, because I'm not going to pretend it's been quite easy for me, particularly this year, to be mostly cynical about all manner of things. And it's not just that I don't want to live into that, it's also that our podcast reminds me I don't have to. I can choose to do something different. And I can choose to put in the energy to be different, but also that I can choose to be around people who can be a source of energy so that we can keep going. So that's really what I'm leaving with today. And I'm thankful for our conversation.
And in the spirit of uncertain times, it will be a surprise what our next episode is about. Because the three of us have nothing to interview each other about anymore. I mean, that's not really true, is it? But we're going to move on with the experiment and make it less focused on each of our themes. Instead, we're going to make it more discussions and hopefully invite some guests on after, a few more experiments. So I'm really looking forward to that and loving doing this with both of you.
Sounds great, Heather.
Yes, I am as well. And I'm looking forward to what we come up with collectively as our next steps for this podcast.
So with that, thank you, everybody. And thank you to Alex in Wonderland for our theme song, Climb Aboard. You can check out the show notes for links to the article that I quoted from and to find out more about each of us.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.